secrets only the shadows knew. In the dead of night, the narrow alleys and gas-lit streets became the hunting ground of a figure so elusive, so terrifying, that his very name would echo through history. Jack the Ripper. But who was this faceless predator? A ghost slipping through the darkness, or a man hiding in plain sight? His story is more than blood and terror. It is a reflection of the time and place that allowed his legend to thrive. As we step into the dark heart of Victorian London, you'll find yourself immersed in an era teetering on the edge of progress and peril. Whitechapel was not the glittering city of wealth and privilege that many associate with the Victorian age. Here, life was grim, brutal, and often tragically short. It was a place where poverty reigned, crime was rampant, and fear was a familiar companion. Into this cauldron of desperation stepped a killer whose brutality shocked even the hardened citizens of the East End. His name was never known, but his legacy would become immortal, etched into the annals of history as Jack the Ripper. Before we continue, I want to quickly welcome you to ASMR History, where I unravel the mysteries of the past, one whisper at a time. Today, I invite you to join me as we dive into one of the most notorious and haunting unsolved cases in history, the chilling tale of Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was more than just a name. He was a spectre that haunted the back streets of Whitechapel. His victims, many of them women struggling to survive in the harsh realities of London's working class underbelly, became symbols of the brutalities that lurked in the shadows of the industrialised world. The newspapers of the time painted him as a monster, a man whose savagery knew no bounds, and yet his identity remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. Who was he? Why did he kill? And why, after more than a century, do we remain captivated by his story? As we unravel the threads of this gruesome tale, we'll delve into the lives of his victims, the working class streets of Whitechapel, and the social backdrop of an England grappling with change. But before we uncover the grisly details, we must first understand the world in which Jack the Ripper lived. The bustling, overcrowded slums of Whitechapel weren't just the setting for these murders. They were a breeding ground for the fear and despair that permeated every dark corner. So, let's begin where every story does, not with the terror of murder, but with the streets and the people who lived there. Whitechapel, 1888, a place where life was as precarious as the shadows themselves. In the late 19th century, London was a city of stark contrasts. On one side, there were the grand halls of the aristocracy, the opulence of the West End, and the towering symbols of the empire. But on the other, far from the glittering lights, lay Whitechapel, a district where life was a daily battle for survival. Here, the air was thick with the stench of poverty, the streets overcrowded with people desperate for work, and crime seemed as inevitable as the dawn. It was a place that the wealthy rarely dared to venture, a place where the shadows held secrets and the streets had no mercy. Whitechapel was a part of London where the divide between the rich and the poor was most brutally felt. People lived crammed into tiny, filthy rooms, often without proper sanitation, where disease was as much a threat as hunger. Crime thrived in this environment of despair. Pickpockets, thieves, and gangs made their living off the misfortunes of others, while the police force, stretched thin and overwhelmed, could do little to stem the tide. It was here, in this grim and hopeless place, that Jack the Ripper would strike, and it was here that his legend would take root. Poverty, wrote crime historian Donald Rumbelow, was a constant companion for the residents of Whitechapel. London in the 1880s was a harsh place for the poor, especially women forced into dangerous professions like prostitution. For the women of Whitechapel, many had few choices. Prostitution was one of the only ways to earn enough to survive, but it came at a terrible cost. These women were vulnerable, alone, and often preyed upon by the criminals who roamed the streets. In Whitechapel, the line between life and death was razor thin. The streets themselves were a maze of narrow alleys and dimly lit passageways. By night, the gas lamps cast long, flickering shadows, turning the fog that often settled over the city into a swirling, impenetrable veil. It was a place where one could disappear into the darkness without a trace. Imagine it now. The distant sound of footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, a horse-drawn carriage rattling by, and the occasional murmur of voices fading into the mist. Whitechapel at night was a place of dread, a place where fear lingered just out of sight. Life for the working class in Whitechapel was brutal. Entire families crammed into single rooms, working long hours for barely enough to eat. The promise of industrial progress that had brought wealth to some had left others far behind. For many, the streets were home. Violence, both inside and outside the home, was an everyday reality. Drunken brawls broke out in the pubs, while domestic abuse festered behind closed doors. The police were largely ineffective, and the law often felt like an afterthought in these parts. As if the daily struggle wasn't enough, Whitechapel had become a breeding ground for crime. Pickpockets and robbers prowled the alleys, waiting for their next victim. Gangs controlled entire neighbourhoods, enforcing their own rules with brutal efficiency. Murder wasn't uncommon in Whitechapel. It was simply another dark fact of life. Yet, even in this environment of violence, the terror that Jack the Ripper brought was different. His killings weren't the result of poverty-driven desperation or gang retaliation. They were something far more sinister, something that sent a shiver down the spine of the entire city. The thick fog, the gas-lit streets, and the eerie silence of Whitechapel after dark made it the perfect hunting ground for a killer like Jack. The darkness seemed to swallow the district whole, erasing the distinction between predator and prey. were sounds in the night, footsteps that might mean danger, or the creak of a door that never should have opened. Fear was everywhere, lurking in the corners of people's minds as much as in the shadows of the streets. But it wasn't just the darkness and the fear that defined Whitechapel. It was also a place of resilience. The people who lived there were survivors, hardened by the relentless grind of life in the East End. They knew hunger, loss, and violence, but they also knew how to endure. It was this strength that allowed them to carry on, even as the Ripper's reign of terror unfolded around them. Yet, no amount of resilience could stop the growing horror. Soon, the women of Whitechapel would become targets in a deadly game. A game they had no idea they were a part of until it was too late. The stage was set. Whitechapel in 1888 was more than just the backdrop for a series of brutal murders. It was a world teetering on the edge of collapse, a powder keg ready to ignite. Now that we understand the streets where the Ripper stalked, it's time to meet the women whose lives were tragically cut short. These were not just victims, they were real people, living in the shadows of society, whose stories deserve to be told. In the shadowy alleys of Whitechapel, life was hard, but death, when it came, was often swift and silent. For 5 women, though, death arrived with a savagery that would leave a city shaken and the world transfixed. They were not the wealthy or powerful. They were the forgotten, the invisible, women struggling to survive in a brutal world. But in their final moments, they would be remembered forever, their names etched into history as the canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. Mary Ann Nichols was the first. Known as Polly to her friends, she had lived a life full of hardship and disappointment. A former wife, a mother, and eventually homeless, Polly turned to the streets to survive, selling herself in exchange for a bed or a few pennies. On the night of August 31st, 1888, her body was found in Bucks Row. Her throat slashed with such violence that it nearly severed her head. The cuts to the throat were of a deep, brutal nature, almost decapitating the victims, recalled police surgeon George Baxter Phillips. This was not a crime of passion or opportunity. This was deliberate, cold-blooded murder. The second victim, Annie Chapman, met a similar fate just over a week later. Annie's life too had been a series of misfortunes. A former domestic servant, she had fallen into destitution after the death of her husband. By the time she met the Ripper, she was living in lodging houses, scraping by as best she could. Her body was discovered on September 8th, 1888, in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Like Polly, her throat had been slashed, but the killer had taken it further. Annie had been mutilated, her abdomen brutally opened. The violence of the crime left investigators shaken. This was no ordinary killer. This was someone who revelled in the mutilation, someone who wanted to send a message. Elizabeth Stride, the third victim, offers a twist in the Ripper's story. Unlike the others, her body was found with only a single wound to the throat, and there were no signs of the grotesque mutilations seen in the earlier killings. It was the night of September 30th, 1888, and Elizabeth's body was discovered in Dupfield's yard. Some have speculated that the Ripper may have been interrupted, forced to flee before he could finish his gruesome work. Elizabeth's life had been marked by poverty and struggle, but her death left many questions. Had she escaped the full horror of the Ripper's wrath, or was she simply not given the time to suffer it? Catherine Edwards was not so fortunate. Found just hours after Elizabeth Stride, Catherine's murder was the most savage yet. Her body was discovered in Mitre Square, and the scene was horrific. Her throat had been slashed, her face was mutilated beyond recognition, and her abdomen had been brutally disemboweled. It was clear that this killer had an insatiable need for violence, a desire to utterly destroy his victims. Catherine's life had been no easier than the others. She had lived on the streets, in and out of workhouses, and like the rest, had resorted to prostitution to survive. But in her death, she had become part of something far darker, a legacy of terror that would haunt London for generations. Finally, there was Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the five. Mary's murder on November 9th, 1888, marked the culmination of the Ripper's reign of terror. Unlike the other victims, Mary was killed indoors, in her small, rented room on Dorset Street. When her body was discovered, the sight was almost unimaginable. Her face was slashed beyond recognition, her throat had been cut down to the spine, and her entire body was mutilated in ways that were too horrific to detail. Mary had been obliterated, as if the killer had unleashed the full extent of his rage upon her. Some have speculated that Mary was the final victim because the killer had finally satisfied his monstrous desires. Others believe he simply faded back into the shadows, content with the horror he had inflicted. Despite the differences in each murder, Elizabeth Stride's lack of mutilation, Mary Kelly's death indoors, the victims all shared commonalities. They were all vulnerable women living on the margins of society. Each one had their throat slashed, a brutal act that seemed to speak of both power and control. For the Ripper, it was never about the act of killing alone. It was about dominance, about the dissection of human life, about turning his victims into symbols of his own twisted desires. As police surgeon George Baxter Phillips noted, the Ripper's use of a knife was both skilled and terrifyingly deliberate, as if he had a deep understanding of human anatomy which only deepened the mystery of who he was. The official police reports detailed the horror with clinical precision, describing post-mortem findings that shocked even the most hardened investigators. In each case, the victim's throat had been cut from left to right, and in most, the mutilations were focused on the abdomen, with organs removed or displaced. The level of precision suggested that the killer was either well practiced or had some form of medical just a victim. They were mothers, daughters, friends, and workers. They lived in a world that offered them few chances and fewer protections, and in the end, they became the ultimate casualties of that world's indifference. Jack the Ripper's victims were more than just names on a list. They were human beings with stories of their own. Their deaths may have been violent, but their lives were marked by the quiet, unspoken struggle of survival in a city that often turned a blind eye to the suffering of its poorest citizens. The brutality they faced in their final moments reflected not just the killer's twisted mind, but also the harsh realities of life in Whitechapel. The murders sent shockwaves through London, and as the bodies piled up, fear gripped the streets of Whitechapel. The police were desperate for answers, but the killer seemed always one step ahead, vanishing into the night like a ghost. It was as if he was taunting the authorities, leaving just enough behind to haunt them, but never enough to capture him. The investigation that followed would become one of the most famous in criminal history, riddled with missteps, dead ends, and false leads. But as we look closer at the investigation, we begin to see not only the challenges the police faced, but also the desperation of a city in the grip of terror. The streets of Whitechapel buzzed with the low hum of fear and tension. With each new body that turned up in the dead of night, a sense of desperation gripped not only the residents of London, but also the men charged with hunting down the killer. Leading the investigation was Inspector Frederick Aberline, a seasoned detective who had seen his fair share of crime, but nothing quite like this. Aberline, along with a dedicated team of officers, was plunged into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. A brutal game of cat and mouse, where the mouse always seemed to disappear into the shadows just before dawn. From the moment Mary Ann Nichols' body was found, the police knew they were dealing with something far more sinister than a simple murder. The sheer brutality of the killings, the precision with which the victims were mutilated, and the seeming randomness of the attacks made the investigation feel like chasing ghosts. Aberline and his men scoured the streets, interrogated suspects, and followed every lead, but the killer remained elusive, slipping away into the labyrinth of Whitechapel's narrow alleys. One of the biggest obstacles the police faced was the sheer size of Whitechapel itself. The area was a maze of crisscrossing streets, dark corners, and hidden passageways, making it an ideal place for a killer to strike and then vanish without a trace. At night, the fog would roll in from the Thames, thickening the air and blurring the edges of vision. Footsteps would echo off the walls, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Even for those familiar with the area, navigating Whitechapel was a challenge. For the police, trying to track down a killer who knew the streets like the back of his hand was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. The investigation became even more complicated when the letters started arriving. The most infamous of these was the Dear Boss letter, received by the Central News Agency On September 27th, 1888, written in a mocking tone, it seemed to taunt the police, daring them to catch the killer. The writer signed the letter Jack the Ripper, and just like that, the faceless murderer had a name. I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled, the letter read, leaving investigators both horrified and intrigued. Was this truly from the killer, or just a hoax meant to stir up more fear? No one could be sure. Then came the from hell letter, the most chilling of all. Unlike the others, it arrived with a gruesome gift, a piece of a human kidney. The letter read, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The kidney was examined by Dr. Thomas Openshaw, who confirmed that it had been removed from a human body, but whether it truly belonged to one of the Ripper's victims remained uncertain. The grotesque nature of the letter only deepened the sense of horror surrounding the case, as the police were now dealing not just with a murderer, but someone who seemed to relish in taunting them, pushing the boundaries of what they thought possible. The letters, though terrifying, didn't bring the police any closer to catching the killer. In fact, they only added to the chaos. The media seized upon the story, whipping the public into a frenzy. Every day, newspapers ran headlines about the Ripper, spreading fear and speculation across London. Witnesses came forward with wild tales, and suspects were dragged in off the streets, only to be released when their alibis held up. The public, hungry for justice, began to lose faith in the police, criticising them for their inability to catch the killer and allowing the myth of Jack the Ripper to grow even larger. But it wasn't just public pressure that hampered the investigation. The limitations of forensic technology at the time were a significant obstacle. The police had no fingerprints to analyse, no DNA to test, and no sophisticated crime scene techniques to rely on. They were working in the dark, relying on witness testimonies and gut instincts in a world where the killer left no clear trail. Even the victims themselves presented a challenge. Many of them were women who lived on the fringes of society, making it difficult for the police to track their movements or identify them immediately. The anonymity of the victims allowed the Ripper to strike with impunity, knowing that by the time anyone noticed they were missing, it was already too late. Geographical confusion also played a role. Whitechapel was a melting pot of immigrants, transient workers, and impoverished families. Many residents spoke little to no English, making communication difficult for the police. Witnesses who may have seen something critical often couldn't convey their observations clearly, and vital details were lost in translation. The Ripper used this confusion to his advantage, blending into the crowd, becoming just another face in the sea of poverty-stricken souls who walked the streets at night. As the bodies piled up, the pressure on Abilene and his team grew unbearable. They were constantly racing against the clock, knowing that at any moment another woman could fall victim to the Ripper's blade. was dissected in the newspapers, further eroding confidence in the police force's ability to solve the case. Abilene was a skilled investigator, but even he couldn't predict the level of media scrutiny that the Ripper case would attract. Despite their best efforts, the investigation eventually hit a dead end. Hundreds of interviews, countless hours of patrolling the streets, and endless paperwork led to nothing but frustration. There were suspects, of course, dozens of them, but no one that the police could definitively link to the crimes. False leads bounded, and every time it seemed they were getting close, the trail went cold. The killer was always just out of reach, watching from the shadows as the police stumbled in the dark. By the end of 1888, it was clear that the investigation was faltering. Public confidence in the police was shattered, and the Ripper had become a symbol of the city's inability to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Inspector Abilene, who had poured his heart and soul into the case, was left with more questions than answers. The frustration was palpable, not just for the police, but for the entire city. How could one man, operating in plain sight, evade capture for so long? The mystery of Jack the Ripper's identity was becoming as infamous as the murders themselves. Who was this man who had terrorised the streets of Whitechapel? A deranged lunatic, a skilled surgeon, a member of the aristocracy hiding in plain sight? Theories began to swirl, each one more tantalising than the last. The Ripper letters had offered clues, but no real answers, and now it was time for the investigation to take a different turn. To examine the suspects and dive into the swirling pool of theories that have captivated the world for over a century. The identity of Jack the Ripper has long been the subject of fevered speculation, with theories and suspects weaving a tangled web of possibilities. From seasoned detectives to armchair historians, everyone has tried to answer the one question that has haunted London since 1888. Who was Jack the Ripper? His crimes were brutal, methodical, and terrifyingly precise, leaving behind a trail of fear and bloodshed, but no clear answers. Over the years, many names have emerged from the fog of Whitechapel, each cloaked in suspicion, but none with enough certainty to lay the mystery to rest. One of the earliest suspects in the case was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and school teacher whose life took a tragic turn in the months following the murders. Druitt came from a respectable background, but there were whispers of mental illness that plagued him in the final years of his life. His death, by drowning in the River Thames in December 1888, was suspiciously close to the cessation of the Ripper's killings. To some investigators, the timing was too convenient to ignore. Could Druitt's suicide have marked the end of the Ripper's reign of terror? While he had no known connection to the victims or any clear motive, his death raised more questions than answers. The absence of evidence linking him directly to the crimes left his involvement a tantalising mystery, one that unsolved to this day. Then there's Aaron Kosminski, annals of ripperology. A Polish immigrant and known to have suffered from severe mental illness, Kosminski was committed to an asylum in the early 1890s, shortly after the last of the Ripper murders. He had a history of violent behaviour, and some accounts suggest that he harboured a deep hatred for women. To the police of the time, Kosminski seemed like a likely suspect, a man capable of the grotesque mutilations that defined the Ripper's crimes. In recent years, DNA evidence has been linked to Kosminski through a shawl supposedly found at one of the murder scenes, though the accuracy of this evidence is still hotly debated. Could it be that Aaron Kosminski, a man lost to madness, was the monster who stalked the foggy streets of Whitechapel? As the years passed, the theories grew wilder, extending beyond the confines of logic and into the realm of conspiracy. Perhaps the most infamous of these involves none other than Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson. Known affectionately as Eddie, the prince was linked to the Ripper killings in a bizarre twist of rumour and scandal. Some believed that Eddie, who was rumoured to have had a secret life filled with debauchery, may have been involved in the murders to cover up a royal indiscretion. But the theory crumbles under scrutiny. Eddie was not even in London during several of the murders, and there is no evidence to suggest he had any involvement. Still, the notion that the Ripper could have been a member of the royal family persists, a reflection of the public's fascination with the idea that even the highest echelons of society might hide dark, dangerous secrets. Another intriguing figure is James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant whose posthumous diary sparked a firestorm of controversy in the 1990s. The diary, discovered in an old trunk, purported to reveal that Maybrick was, in fact, Jack the Ripper. Written in a disjointed, cryptic style, the diary describes a man consumed by madness and driven to kill. The authenticity of the diary has been the subject of intense debate, with many experts dismissing it as a hoax. But for those who believe in its legitimacy, the diary offers a rare glimpse into the mind of a man who might just have been the Ripper. Maybrick's life was one of turbulence and personal demons, and though there is little concrete evidence linking him to the murders, his name remains etched in the long list of potential suspects. Of course, the list of suspects does not end there. Some have speculated that Jack the Ripper was a member of the medical profession, someone with surgical skills and knowledge of anatomy, given the precision with which the victims were mutilated. This theory gave rise to suspects like Sir William Gull, Queen Victoria's royal physician, and Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, a notorious killer who was hanged in 1892. Cream, known as the Lambeth Poisoner, reportedly uttered the words, "I am Jack," as he was led to the gallows, fueling speculation that he might have been confessing to the Ripper crimes in his final moments. But the theory has been largely dismissed, as Cream was imprisoned in America during the time of the Whitechapel murders. Still, the possibility that Jack the Ripper possessed medical knowledge has kept this line of inquiry alive for over a century. As crime historian Martin Fido noted, the identity of Jack the Ripper will likely remain a mystery, though the most plausible suspects range from a deranged man to someone with surgical skills. Indeed, the debate rages on among modern-day criminologists and historians. Each new piece of evidence, each new theory, adds a layer of complexity to the mystery, but none have provided definitive answers. Could Jack the Ripper have been a lone madman, driven by psychosis to commit unspeakable acts? Or was he a calculating, cold-blooded killer, hiding in plain sight among the respectable citizens of Victorian London? In recent years, modern forensic techniques have attempted to crack the case once and for all. DNA testing, unavailable to investigators in the 19th century, has been used to analyse evidence from the crime scenes, including the aforementioned shawl linked to Aaron Kosminski. While the results seemed to point in his direction, they were far from conclusive, and many experts remain sceptical of the findings. The problem with such old evidence is that it has been handled by so many people over the years that contamination is almost inevitable. Even with today's technology, the mystery remains as elusive as ever. The allure of Jack the Ripper lies not just in the horror of his crimes, but in the enigma of his identity. Was he a deranged lunatic, a member of the aristocracy, or perhaps someone no one ever suspected? Theories abound, ranging from the plausible to the fantastical, but after more than a century, we are no closer to uncovering the truth. The Ripper has become a ghost, a figure who lurks not just in the dark alleys of Whitechapel, but in the recesses of our collective imagination. The enduring fascination with Jack the Ripper is not only fueled by the gruesome nature of his crimes, but also by the media frenzy that surrounded the investigation. The public's appetite for stories about the Ripper seemed insatiable, and the newspapers were more than happy to oblige, turning the murders into a sensation that gripped London and the world. As the press scrambled for headlines, the line between fact and fiction blurred, creating a myth that would endure for generations. Now, as we turn our attention to the media and public reaction, we'll explore how the Ripper became not just a murderer, but a legend. The murders began quietly, as many tragedies do. A woman's body found in the early hours, slashed and lifeless in a dark alleyway. But as the Ripper's body count grew, so did the roar of the press, and what began as whispers in the streets soon became front-page news across the country. It was the media that took Jack the Ripper's name and etched it into history, transforming a killer into a legend and his crimes into a national scandal. The Whitechapel Murders have struck fear into the hearts of all Londoners. No woman is safe, wrote the Illustrated Police News in 1888, a chilling declaration that only fanned the flames of public terror. At the time, the British press was evolving, reaching a wider audience than ever before. Literacy rates were rising, and with them, the appetite for sensational news. The public didn't just want to read about the murders, they demanded Newspapers, eager to satisfy their readers' thirst for scandal, obliged with lurid descriptions of the victims' mutilated bodies, the mysterious figure haunting the foggy streets, and the police's desperate but fruitless attempts to stop him. It was here, in the ink of these headlines, that the legend of Jack the Ripper was born. The press coined the infamous name Jack the Ripper after the Dear Boss letter, one of the many taunting messages purportedly sent by the killer. It was a stroke of brilliance. Whether a genuine missive or a hoax, the letter gave the faceless murderer a persona. Jack the Ripper wasn't just a man who killed. He was a spectre who lurked in the shadows, a boogeyman for a city on edge. The newspapers ran with it, printing every rumour, every new theory, and every whisper of fear. The more they printed, the more the panic spread. It was as though Jack himself had stepped off the page and into the minds of every Londoner. The public's reaction was swift and frantic. Women no longer walked alone at night, and those who had to were gripped by constant fear. Vigilante groups formed in Whitechapel, patrolling the streets in hopes of catching the killer, or at least deterring him. These groups, though well-intentioned, often added to the chaos. They fanned the flames of fear and suspicion, turning neighbours against each other in a desperate hunt for the Ripper. Every stranger became a suspect, every unusual glance a reason to be on edge. In the absence of concrete leads from the police, the people took matters into their own hands, but their efforts proved as fruitless as the official investigation. Amid the fear, anger toward the police grew. The public had little faith in Scotland Yard's ability to catch the killer, and the media stoked this frustration. Headlines accused the police of incompetence, suggesting that if they had acted sooner or been more diligent, the murders could have been prevented. In the eyes of many Londoners, the police were failing their most vulnerable citizens, the women of Whitechapel who had been abandoned to their grisly fates. Protests broke out, with demands for justice and cries for the government to step in. The press continued to stir at the pot, painting a picture of a city on the verge of collapse, with Jack the Ripper looming over it all like a dark cloud. But there was more to this story than just fear and outrage. Beneath the headlines, class tensions were simmering. Whitechapel was a district populated largely by the working class and immigrants, and these murders exposed the deep divides in Victorian society. Many in the upper classes viewed the East End with disdain, seeing it as a breeding ground for crime and degeneracy. The Ripper's murders seemed, to some, like an inevitable result of the area's poverty and desperation. Meanwhile, the poor felt abandoned by the very systems that were supposed to protect them, further widening the rift between the classes. Xenophobia also reared its ugly head during the Ripper investigation. With no clear suspect, immigrants, particularly the Jewish community in Whitechapel, became convenient scapegoats. Rumours spread that the Ripper was a foreigner preying on English women. Anti-Semitic sentiment grew, with mobs attacking Jewish businesses and blaming them for harbouring the killer. This xenophobic backlash reflected the growing tension in London brutal as they were, became a focal point for broader anxieties about crime, poverty, and the changing face of London itself. In the end, the media's role in the Jack the Ripper saga was both a reflection of and a catalyst for the public sphere. The press had created a monster, both in the form of Jack the Ripper and in the way the murders were sensationalised. But they also fueled the conversation about the deeper issues plaguing Victorian society: the plight of the poor, the failures of the police, and the deep-seated prejudices that divided London's population. Jack the Ripper's name may have dominated the headlines, but his crimes exposed cracks in the foundation of the city itself. As the frenzy surrounding the murders continued to grow, the legend of Jack the Ripper only intensified. His name became synonymous with the fear of the unknown, with the dangers lurking just beyond the gaslit streets of Whitechapel. But beyond the panic and sensationalism, there was a larger question at play. How would the world remember Jack the Ripper? His legacy would go far beyond the terror of 1888, shaping the way future generations viewed crime, justice, and the mysteries of the human mind. Jack the Ripper may have disappeared into the fog of Whitechapel in 1888, but his shadow has never truly left us. His name lingers, whispered on the wind, a figure both terrifying and tantalising, whose legend has only grown with the passage of time. From the moment the murders were etched into the headlines, the Ripper transcended the role of a mere killer. He became something more, a symbol of the unknown, the embodiment of fear that cannot be seen, touched, or caught. He is, as author Patricia Cornwell once wrote, the quintessential figure of evil, an unsolvable enigma that haunts the criminal underworld. Jack the Ripper's legacy is not just the blood he spilled in the back alleys of London. It is the way he captured the imagination of the world. Over a century has passed, and yet we are still fascinated by him. His story has been retold in countless books, movies, and TV shows, each iteration adding new layers to the mystery. From Sherlock Holmes chasing the Ripper through the foggy streets of London, to modern-day retellings in series like Ripper Street or the chilling graphic novel From Hell, Jack has become a fixture of popular culture. He's more than just a murderer now. He's a cultural icon, a boogeyman for the ages. What is it about Jack the Ripper that keeps us coming back to his story? Perhaps it is the sheer audacity of his crimes, the cold-blooded nature of his killings that were so brutal they shocked even a city accustomed to violence. Or maybe it's the mystery itself, the fact that after all these years we still don't know who he was. The allure of the unsolved case is irresistible. There's something about a mystery without a resolution that continues to draw us in, to make us speculate, theorise, and wonder. The Ripper is a puzzle, one with pieces that never quite fit, and that is what makes him so enduring. In London, the legacy of Jack the Ripper is more than just stories in books or scenes in films. His presence can be felt in the streets of Whitechapel even today, where the Ripper's Trail has become a dark pilgrimage for curious minds, Ripper tourism has blossomed, with guided walks retracing the steps of both the killer and his victims. Tourists flock to the East End, eager to stand in the very spots where history's most infamous murderer once stalked his prey. Plaques mark the locations of the killings, and local pubs and shops trade on the Ripper's name, offering everything from Ripper Ale to Ripper-themed souvenirs. There is something macabre, yet undeniably captivating, about walking the same streets where Jack once lurked, a thrill that has turned the Ripper into a strange kind of legend. But it's not just popular culture or tourism that has kept Jack the Ripper in the spotlight. His case also left a profound impact on the world of criminology. The Ripper Murders exposed the shortcomings of 19th century policing, but they also inspired new methods of investigation that would change the course of history. The police's inability to catch him highlighted the need for a more systematic approach to solving crimes, one that would eventually lead to the birth of criminal profiling. In many ways, Jack the Ripper was the original inspiration for what we now call profiling. Though rudimentary by today's standards, the attempt to understand the killer's psychology, his motivations, his likely habits, his potential identity, was groundbreaking at the time. Investigators like Inspector Frederick Aberline and Dr. Thomas Bond began to theorize that the Ripper's actions were not random, that they revealed something about the man himself. Bond, in particular, offered what could be seen as one of the earliest examples of criminal profiling when he suggested that Jack was a man of solitary habits and subject to periodic attacks of homicidal and erotic mania. These early attempts at profiling would lay the groundwork for modern forensic psychology, an essential tool in today's investigations. The fascination with Jack the Ripper has also inspired academic studies, from historians to criminologists, trying to piece together not just the facts of the case, but the social and psychological conditions that allowed the murders to happen. Theories abound, some plausible, some outlandish, and each new piece of evidence, no matter how small, reignites the debate. Scholars study not only the Ripper himself, but the world he inhabited, examining the socio-economic factors of Victorian London, the role of women in society, and the failure of law enforcement to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The Ripper case has become a lens through which we view not just a singular moment in history, but a broader picture of human nature and the complexities of justice. In modern times, the Ripper has inspired a wave of criminal investigation methods that would have been unimaginable in 1888. The techniques that failed to catch him, blood analysis, fingerprinting, DNA, are now at the forefront of solving cases worldwide. The Ripper case is often studied in police academies and universities as a cautionary tale about the limitations of early detective work and the evolution of modern forensic science. His crimes were not just a stain on Victorian catalyst for change in how we approach the darkest corners of human behaviour. Yet, despite the advancements in forensic science, despite the dozens of books, films, and documentaries that dissect his every move, Jack the Ripper remains elusive. The mystery of his identity endures, and with it, the unsettling realization that some questions may never be answered. But perhaps that is part of his legacy too. Jack the Ripper, like the city he terrorized, is a reflection of the human fascination with fear, with the unknown, with the monsters we cannot see but know are there. As time marches on, new generations will discover the Ripper's story, will walk the same shadowy streets and feel that familiar chill of the unsolved mystery. They'll pore over the details, hoping to be the one to finally solve the riddle. But Jack, it seems, will always remain just out of reach, a ghost in the fog. His legacy is not just that of a killer, but of a legend that continues to grow, evolve, and haunt the imaginations of those who seek to understand the dark corners of history. And as we reflect on the lasting impact of Jack the Ripper, we begin to see that his true legacy lies not in the murders themselves, but in the way he has shaped our understanding of crime, of fear, and of the mysteries that still remain unsolved. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey through the fog-filled streets of Whitechapel, where shadows moved, fear lingered, and a name whispered in the night changed the way we think about crime forever. Jack the Ripper, as elusive today as he was over a century ago, continues to captivate us, not only because of the brutality of his acts, but because of the mystery that surrounds him. He remains a puzzle without a solution, a story without an ending, and that is why we can't quite let him go. The case remains unresolved, an enduring enigma in the history of criminology, but perhaps it's this very uncertainty that keeps our fascination alive. How could a man in the heart of London disappear so completely, leaving no trace but terror? The fear of the unknown has always been one of our deepest anxieties, and Jack the Ripper taps into that fear, reminding us that some mysteries are beyond our reach, lingering in the dark corners of the world. As I've walked you through the lives of his victims, the desperate police investigation, and the theories that attempt to unravel his identity, it's clear we are left with more questions than answers. But perhaps that is the lasting legacy of Jack the Ripper. He is not just a man from history. He's become a myth, a symbol of the darkness that lurks at the edges of society, always out of reach, always just beyond the light. This story endures because it speaks to something in us all, the desire to uncover the truth, to shine a light on the shadows, to solve the unsolvable. Yet, the Ripper reminds us that some mysteries will forever remain in the fog, waiting for those curious enough to search. If you've been as captivated by this tale as I have, there are many more stories waiting to be explored, more mysteries buried in the past to uncover. I invite invite you to subscribe to ASMR History and join me on these journeys where every whisper reveals a new chapter in the story